There are discoveries that you make about yourself as you get older. Different ways that you, open up and become available.
By the time Paul Newman reached 83, love no longer felt like something to explain. It felt like something to finally understand. He had lived a long public life, shaped by success, temptation, devotion, and regret. And he never claimed otherwise. Fame brought noise. Time brought clarity. Paul understood that not every relationship defines you. Some pass through, some leave scars, and one, if you are fortunate, becomes the quiet place everything else returns to. In his later years, when interviews slowed and reflection deepened, he spoke less about achievement and more about what endured, about the woman who remained when ambition faded, when mistakes were admitted, when applause no longer mattered. For decades, he rarely said her name aloud, but age has a way of removing hesitation. And at 83, Paul Newman was finally ready to tell the truth. Before love had a name. Paul Newman was born in 1925 in Shaker Heights, Ohio, a quiet, orderly place that offered stability, but not much instruction on emotion. His father ran a sporting goods store. His mother encouraged art and theater. From the beginning, Paul lived between two worlds, discipline and imagination. As a boy, he learned early how to behave, how to perform respectability, how to keep things contained. But restlessness followed him. He was athletic, charming, and observant, traits that later became strengths, but first showed up as uncertainty. He didn't yet know who he was meant to be. World War II interrupted everything. Paul served in the Navy, where an injury redirected his life and quietly planted a sense of unfinished purpose. When the war ended, many men returned home ready to settle. Paul didn't. He drifted, through college, through early acting classes, through a first marriage that offered security, but not depth. Hollywood came next, but not smoothly. Early roles were uneven. Comparisons to other leading men haunted him. He was talented, but talent alone didn't settle the question he carried inside. Where do I belong? Behind the handsome face and growing recognition was a man still searching for emotional footing. Fame arrived before clarity. Applause came before understanding. Paul later admitted that success, early on, made him careless. With time, with relationships, with himself. This was the version of Paul Newman before love became grounding, before commitment became conscious, before he understood that partnership wasn't something that limited him. It was something that could steady him. He didn't know it yet, but everything he struggled with, restlessness, doubt, ambition, was preparing him to recognize something rare when it finally appeared. Sometimes you have to live unfinished for a long time before you know what completion feels like. And at this point in his life, Paul Newman was still very much unfinished. She entered without announcement. When Paul Newman first crossed paths with Joanne Woodward, nothing about it felt dramatic. No instant certainty, no grand declaration, just recognition, slow, measured, unsettling in its quietness. They met in the early 1950s, both still shaping themselves, both serious about craft rather than image. Joanne was not impressed by surface charm. She listened closely. She observed more than she spoke. Paul noticed that immediately. In a world that rewarded performance, she seemed uninterested in spectacle. What drew him in wasn't beauty alone, though she had that, but her composure. Joanne carried herself with an inner order Paul lacked at the time. She wasn't chasing a rival. She was already rooted. That steadiness challenged him. It also calmed him. Their connection grew cautiously. Respect came before romance. Conversation before closeness. Joanne saw Paul clearly. His talent, his restlessness, his tendency to drift when praised too easily. She didn't try to fix him. She simply didn't pretend not to notice. Paul, for his part, found himself paying attention in a way he hadn't before. He listened. He stayed. He questioned himself. Being around Joanne didn't make him feel larger than life. It made him feel more accurate. There were complications. Paul was still married. Hollywood was watching. Choices carried consequences. And for a time, restraint mattered more than desire. That restraint shaped what followed. Later, Paul would reflect that what mattered most wasn't how quickly love arrived, but how deliberately it stayed. Joanne didn't rush him. She didn't compete with his ambition. She simply stood where she was, fully present, and let him decide who he wanted to become beside her. Some people don't change you by pushing. They change you by not moving. Paul Newman didn't know it then, but this was the moment his life began to turn. Not loudly, not publicly, but with intention. Loving a man the world never let rest. Marriage did not slow Paul Newman. Fame accelerated him. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Paul was no longer just a promising actor. He was becoming a symbol. The roles grew heavier. The expectations are louder. Hollywood rewarded his intensity, but it also demanded constant motion. Stillness became a luxury. For Joanne Woodward, loving Paul meant understanding that the world rarely let him pause. Success followed him home. Temptation followed him everywhere. Paul never hid that truth later in life. He admitted to absences, emotional and physical, moments when ambition took precedence over presence. What made their marriage endure wasn't denial. It was honesty. Joanne didn't romanticize his flaws, and Paul didn't excuse them. When he faltered, he acknowledged it. When guilt followed, he didn't pretend it was misplaced. That kind of truth is uncomfortable, but it is also stabilizing. Joanne continued her own career, often choosing depth over exposure. She understood that independence was not distance, it was balance. Paul admired that deeply. He once admitted that Joanne's strength forced him to confront his own irresponsibility, not through confrontation, but through contrast. There were years when the marriage bent under pressure. Paul later spoke of how easily fame can distort judgment, how quickly admiration can be mistaken for permission. Yet he also made clear that through all of it, Joanne remained the fixed point, not passive, not patient in silence, present and demanding accountability. Love in their case was not about perfection. It was about repair, about returning, about choosing to stay engaged even when retreat would have been easier. Some marriages survive because nothing goes wrong. Others survive because the truth is never avoided. Paul Newman never claimed to be an ideal husband, but he understood eventually that the woman who stayed, and expected him to do the same, was the reason his life did not fracture under success. The marriage that survived the noise. By the time the public stopped counting box office numbers and started calling Paul Newman a legend, something quieter had already taken hold at home. The middle years of his marriage were not dramatic. They were deliberate. Paul and Joanne Woodward learned how to live alongside success without letting it dominate the center of their lives. They worked separately. They raised children. They built routines that didn't belong to Hollywood. Privacy became a form of protection. Joanne once said that longevity didn't come from constant togetherness, but from mutual respect for each other's inner lives. Paul agreed. They gave one another space, not as distance, but as trust. He raced cars. She pursued challenging roles. Neither demanded that the other shrink to preserve the marriage. What held them together wasn't romance in the public sense. It was shared seriousness, shared values, a shared understanding that love wasn't proven by attention, but by consistency. They chose each other again and again, often quietly, away from cameras. Paul later admitted that these years taught him something fame never could. Success feels empty if there's no one steady waiting on the other side of it. Joanne provided that steadiness, not by centering herself around him, but by remaining firmly herself. They argued, they disagreed, they aged, but they also laughed, privately, freely, without performance. That laughter didn't belong to the audience. It belonged to the life they protected. In a culture that celebrates beginnings, Paul came to value endurance. The long middle, the years no one writes headlines about. Most love stories aren't lost in the ending. They're tested in the middle. For Paul Newman, this was when love stopped feeling fragile and began to feel reliable. Regret spoken without excuses. In his later years, Paul Newman spoke about regret with unusual directness. Not defensively, not dramatically, just honestly. He never framed his mistakes as misunderstandings or blamed the era he lived in. He acknowledged that success gave him opportunities and that he didn't always handle them well. Absence, distraction, emotional negligence. These were not abstract ideas to him. They were specific failures he could name. What mattered was how he spoke about them. Paul did not regret loving Joanne Woodward. He regretted not always showing it in ways that counted. He once admitted that ambition made him selfish at times, that work came home with him even when he was physically present. That realization came late, but it came clearly. And clarity, for Paul, was never about self-punishment. It was about responsibility. Joanne didn't erase his regret by forgiving it away. She lived with it honestly, the way long marriages do, acknowledging what was lost without letting it poison what remained. Paul respected that. He understood that forgiveness, when it's real, doesn't cancel memory. It coexists with it. What Paul never questioned was where his loyalty ultimately belonged. Despite temptation, despite wandering moments, he never confused passing desire with lasting devotion. Regret sharpened that understanding. It didn't weaken it. As he aged, Paul spoke less about career and more about presence, about wishing he had listened more carefully, about wishing he had slowed down sooner. These weren't complaints. They were acknowledgments. Regret doesn't mean you chose wrong. Sometimes it means you finally understand the cost. Paul Newman learned that love is not measured by the absence of mistakes, but by the willingness to name them and still stay. The love he never replaced. When Paul Newman spoke about the end of life, he didn't talk about fear. He talked about gratitude. As the years narrowed and illness reshaped daily routines, Paul's world grew smaller and clearer. Fame receded. Roles no longer mattered. What remained was the person who had shared the long middle with him, who understood his silences without asking him to explain them. After Joanne Woodward's health declined, Paul became fiercely protective. He stepped back from public life, choosing presence over visibility. Those close to him noticed the change. He wasn't retreating. He was prioritizing. Those close to him noticed the shift. He was no longer dividing himself between ambition and devotion. He had chosen where he belonged. Care replaced performance. Loyalty replaced legacy building. Paul never spoke of this period as sacrifice. He treated it as continuity, the natural extension of a life shared. The love he had built did not require replacement, escape, or distraction. It required attention. In his final years, Paul spoke of Joanne not with nostalgia, but with certainty. Not passion, not infatuation. Certainty. She remained the constant against which everything else had been measured. Time did not weaken that truth. It refined it. Some loves don't end with loss. They endure through presence. Paul Newman never replaced the love of his life, not because it was gone, but because it was still there. What he finally understood. By the time Paul Newman reached the end of his life, love no longer felt complicated. It felt settled. He understood that passion fades, ambition exhausts, and applause eventually grows quiet. What remains is not intensity, but continuity. Not perfection, but presence. Not the absence of mistakes, but the choice to stay honest inside them. The love of his life was not defined by drama or devotion alone, but by endurance. By a woman who saw him clearly, stayed grounded, and never asked him to be someone else. In the end, Paul Newman didn't speak about love as something he found. He spoke about it as something he kept. And perhaps that is the truest kind of love any life can know. If this story resonated with you, stay with us. Some truths deserve to be told slowly.